many ways, this past year has exemplified the common saying that truth is stranger than fiction. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, and regular people have spent months marching in the streets to demand racial justice. Recently, a fascist mob tried to take over the United States Capitol, spurred on by the ravings of a former reality TV host who happens to be our president. No one could be blamed for wishing that this country was following a different narrative. Writer and academic Dr. Nicholas Powers believes that a better future is possible, and he's made it his mission to inspire today's leftists by writing speculative fiction that imagines what the future could look like under progressive policies. Stories such as A Socialist Christmas Carol, Dr. Powers' contribution to the latest issue of Democratic Left, are a powerful reminder that things don't always have to be this way. Dr. Powers is a poet, novelist, and literature professor at SUNY Old Westbury. He's also a contributing editor at Democratic Left. His upcoming novel, Thirst, will be published by Upset Press in February, and his first book, The Ground Below Zero, came out in 2014. I'm Alexander Lee with Democratic Left, and it's my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicholas Powers. Welcome, Dr. Powers.
Hey, thank you so much. It's good to see you.
Lots of fiction is political, not even the fiction that is overtly ideological, but your stories, especially the ones that you've published with outlets like The Independent and Democratic Left, are pretty explicitly ideological. So what do you hope to accomplish by writing this kind of, overtly progressive fiction?
Another world is possible, but even more so, another world already exists inside of our heads. And it's not just the individual author's mind, but when I'm writing, there's a part of my writing that's obviously my own idiosyncratic, images and poetry and words and experiences and emotional angles on stories. But when you go deeper, you begin to hit a kind of collective consciousness. And that collective consciousness is the desires, the hopes, the fears that are, in a sense, kind of suppressed in what I would say is the communal body. In other words, that because we're all living in the same system, that same system, in a sense, pushes down similar emotions into all of us. And so those become innately political because when you release them through fiction, you get a glimpse of what we're really feeling inside, but then you also channel them through imagery, plot lines, or stories or characters, which allow us to actually imagine practicing this in real life. And practicing things in imagination is an inherently political act, because then you can practice that in physical action. And you can actually start to make the world slowly or very quickly resemble the one that you've imagined. And so I think fiction is a practice for politics.
So something that really strikes me about your stories is that they are about the future. And it's a future that's recognizable and that is traced from the world that we live in today. But your work is different from other examples of activist fiction that I've read, such as, The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, or, A Raisin in the Sun, or really anything by Lorraine Hansberry that kind of depicted the problems with the world as it is. So why don't you have this kind of focus? Do you think it's because we all already know these problems and we don't need to be reminded of them? Or why use the future as the staging ground for these stories?
Well, the future is a battleground between this kind of like a conservative dystopia and I would say maybe kind of a left liberal or progressive, not utopia, but at least a kind of saving of the world, right? And there's these two kind of impulses. And so we're always wrestling over the future. And for me, there's a kind of an anthropological skepticism that conservative dystopians fiction has, that we're just kind of, like Thomas Hobbes, where we're brutish, life is short, it's animalistic, we're red in blood and claw. And it's a very kind of pessimistic look on human nature. Now, obviously, there's the kind of Rousseauian tradition of the noble savage, and that we're actually innately good, and that we're kind of corrupted by civilization. And in some ways, I say that we're both. That we have both of those possibilities, and I think history bears that out. But what I tried to do in the fiction of the future is imagine that the need for redemption is actually at the core of a working class populism. Because what I've experienced in daily life is that the more desperate people are, sometimes the harsher they are, and they compete for each other for scarce resources, but it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. The kind of cruelty that you have to do to sometimes survive when you're poor, working class, just carries with it the burden of a lot of violence that's being done to yourself or others. And one of the things that I like about imagining a future Green Deal is that it actually imagines a kind of global humanist project in which people can, in a sense, redeem themselves from the violence that it took to survive in a very kind of social Darwinistic capitalism. And in that comes like a lot of sense of redemption, redemption through work, redemption through saving other people's lives. And I think that that's the kind of emotional engine that I wind up tapping into. And it's also the emotional engine I've seen other groups tap into, like say the Nation of Islam, for all of obviously its ideological, theological problems, which would be boring to get into. But one thing they offer is a sense of redemption for people who believe, in it. And so that's the thing I find appealing about the Green New Deal. It's not just about its technological, you know, dazzling, infrastructure, but it's about how does it actually transform people who work on it.
Wow. So that brings me to another question that I was hoping to ask, which is, what is the audience that you have in mind when you write these stories? I mean, from listening to what you were saying just now, I mean, it sounds like to some extent the effort is to help people who are already progressive understand the forces that, make people maybe not act in their best interest.
Mhm.
But is there any aspect of trying to convince conservatives or liberals of the importance of progressive policies as well?
Yeah, I would say the three parts, the three components that make the audience that are implicit in my head are people who I know, right? So one are, left liberal activists who need a vision beyond political discourse, something very sharply cut, like a movie that they could see. Um, the second would be working class people who just pick up the newsletter or pick up a copy of the Independent at a laundromat or at a cafe or at Dunkin' Donuts, like so. So the indie and other publications physically go out a lot of interesting places.
Mhm.
But then third is that if a conservative would read this, that they would be taken in not necessarily by the political argument, but by the emotional acuity with which the characters are drawn. So that there's a part of it that's actually not political, but it's just how do humans act in this situation? They have to be recognizably human characters and not kind of mouthpieces for political ideology. And so I would hope that even a conservative would read that and say, I could see myself in this. And once they see themselves in that personality type, they get carried along by the movement of the story. And then maybe
Mhm.
against their own, expectations, maybe surprised, they wind up agreeing with the ideology.
So you talk about drawing from the people you know in your real life when you write these stories. I want to explore that idea a little more, specifically with regards to A Socialist Christmas Carol. So for anyone watching who hasn't had a chance to read this story yet, without spoiling too much, it's a socialist take on, the classic tale of Scrooge and the three ghosts. It's about an activist who is starting to feel disillusioned with the lack of progress that she's observed during her time in the trenches. And she almost gives up on activism and is visited by three progressive ghosts who show her what the world could be like. And it's a really charming story. It has a pretty serious emotional punch. Um, Multiple people have written into Democratic Left to say that they cried after reading it, and I want to ask you for your thoughts on that later. But more immediately, what inspired you to write this story? I mean, were any of the characters who felt so real inspired by real activists who you've met?
It always struck me that the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens was in a sense about, giving someone a spiritual second chance by having them reconnect with the world rather than being walled off by money. That's Scrooge McDuck. And I think that for activists, people can get walled off by two major things from each other. One is jargon, right? So you cease to actually talk like a real person, and everything is reduced to like some political, you know, um, you know, just almost it's like marbles in the mouth.
Right.
And the other thing is cynicism, self-righteousness or cynicism. Like when you have one emotional tone that is the dominant one and like it becomes like a wall, you can't actually deal with the dynamic flows of people's emotions up and down and sideways because you're just always on this one note, right?
Mhm.
Cynicism or self-righteousness. And so I've met people like that. And some of those people who are really talented drift away from the movement. And I wanted to give a sense of how a historical overview of the long kind of march and also acknowledging through this kind of hallucinatory time travel, um, how actually dealing with your real human emotions allows you to reconnect with the movement, but also allows for the movement to reconnect with one's real humanity. And so it's kind of a kind of a deep kind of interacting nourishment, where
Mhm.
the movement can get refueled by a real acknowledgement of how you actually feel. And then you looking at the overall context of the movement throughout time can say, okay, maybe my feelings need to be acknowledged, but they don't need to determine, every single like decision I make. Maybe I can lift above that and see the long picture. And that could be like my guiding star.
I love that answer, and I think it backs up why I think Democratic Left was a good fit for this story. Because for me, something that I think is really, this is kind of half question, half comment, but something that's been really powerful about joining DSA is that it's allowed me to take that longer view, because I've worked directly with leftists who have been out in the streets since the 1960s, and a lot of people who are, I'm 25, a lot of people who are my age, I think are fairly disillusioned by the lack of positive social change that we've seen, during our lifetime. But DSA has helped me get through that and has kind of erased that cynicism from my mind.
Hmm.
And I mean, I'm wondering, as you write these stories, you're an active DSA member. Where does an organization like DSA fit into these futures? How does it help us get to this kind of progressive
There,
goal?
the image of the Olympic torch, and
Mm-hmm.
every athlete across the world, like, takes the torch until it gets, I think, to Athens, Greece, right? And they relight the fire, or wherever the Olympics are being held. Um, in some ways, I think the DSA is like that. It carries the torch. Every generation it's saying you have the torch that will illuminate a positive future. And you have to be both very careful with this fire, like you can't let it die out, but you also have to be very, in some ways, brave with it and take risk with it and try to, set things on fire that aren't already lit. So you have to set people's imaginations aflame. You have to set their hopes aflame. And so I think the DSA is, in a sense, kind of carrying that kind of Olympic torch forward, and the older generation is saying to the younger one, okay, now it's yours, right? And, to be honest, we're at a moment where stories are proliferating across different genres of generational handing
Mm-hmm.
off of the baton. Um, I may not necessarily be a big fan of the most recent Star Wars movies, but what's pretty clear is that it's a generational handing of the baton, from one generation to the next. And there's other genres that are doing very similar motives, right? Because the millennial generation is just so huge, right? And Gen Z, so huge. And so people are like, okay, now it's your turn. And so the DSA to me is carrying, that torch one step further. And I understand that in many ways it's being, very careful with it. Like, what do we do now that there's higher interest in socialism than there has ever been before? And at the same time, there's this interest in fascism as a kind of competing right-wing force that offers the opposing side a whole kind of self-enclosed, kind of quarantined mythology. And they have their victims, except their victims are white people being displaced by the diversity of America. And their victims are things, like statues that are being toppled. And their idea of community is is of shared hating of the other. And so there's this whole kind of mythology that is fueling them, and now they're rising. The thing is that ultimately their mythology leads to a dead end, because it's always about how do we separate ourselves from the world and separate ourselves from others and keep ourselves pure. Whereas the socialist mythology is always inherently more open. It's saying, how do we get people who are different in, and how do we build coalitions that span not only generations but really languages, ethnic groups, sexual diversity in the whole world. It's a very different mythology with a different goal. And so I think that's why ultimately it's the one that has to be the most successful, because it has inside of it
Mm-hmm.
doors that open up to the real world, right? And so I think that's what, for me, the DSA is. And I think my only hope is that the DSA continues to actually invoke populism and go and talk and meet people where they're actually at, right? And not retreat into what I've seen other leftist generations do: retreat into book clubs, retreat into sectarianism, retreat into microwave rhetorical language, but constantly exploring the real world and meeting people where they're at, and not being judgmental about them, not trying to harsh their mellow, not kind of coming with the hammer down if they don't speak the right words, but just offering them a lot of grace and a lot of forgiveness and a lot of space, and saying, look, we're all on our different places in the journey, but we're all, in a sense, trying to go in the right direction. And so that's what I hope the essay really does.
And you mentioned these kind of book clubs and the jargon that, people on the left and certainly within DSA can fall into. And I do think that one of the powers of progressive fiction is its accessibility, right? Everyone likes to read fiction.
Mhm.
Um, for a certain person, you can read Capital, you can read the Communist Manifesto, and that will move you to tears if you imagine what it means and what that future could be like. But I mean, again, people, they weep when they read your stories because it's not jargon, it's not theory, it's just a portrait of what the future is like. I mean, so how do you feel when you hear that? Is that your intention? Does it bother you that people cry when they read your work?
I
I
think
don't know. How do you feel?
the only person that I really wanted to have an emotional reaction in the work was the character. I wanted to respect her as a real human being. Like, who is she? What moves her? And so in the end, if she has a turn of heart, that's really the only thing that matters, because that's really what makes the story work. She actually has to be not only believable, but she also
Mhm.
has to believe in the story itself. So it's not just that, she is an authentic person with conflicts, but she at the end of the story has to believe in her own journey. And so when I know that she, or who, whatever main protagonist, um, has reached a transformation, then that's what I care about, and I step back. And I think as long as my focus is on that, then the kind of secondary effect of the reader's emotional reaction to the story, that's a very natural one, and I'm proud of it. But they're in a sense not really reacting to me, they're reacting to the character. And more so, they're reacting to their projection of themselves into the character, because there's something about her
Mhm.
that resonates within them. And so, when they're crying over this, they're crying in a sense for their own transformation, however small or great, just by reading the story. So in some sense, it's not really about me. It's like when people read this, they're recreating the story for themselves. And they, in a sense, wind up becoming the character in a kind of transposed projective way. And so, they're rewriting themselves. I'm not the author anymore. The reader now is the author. And that's the magic of fiction. It's actually much less about the author than the reader.
I really, really like that. Thank you. And also, the future of this as a genre, is this something that you would be interested in producing a journal of at some point, or otherwise,
Yeah.
collectivizing in some way?
And finally, I guess what I'm working on is I'm working on a Green New Deal inspired collection of short stories called Occupy Tomorrow. And I'm going to take elements of the Green New Deal and have characters live them out, you know? And so if there's a part of the new Green Deal that's going to deal with the forest fires in California, um, I would like to have a character named Solomon, who is a former prisoner and who gets early release if he works on these fires, but he's dogged by guilt over his crime. And, he finds a way of reconciling himself with his who he is now through the work of fighting these fires. And so just stories like that trace what a Green New Deal would really do in people's lives.
Wow, I want to read that now. That's really cool. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Powers. I really appreciate hearing your perspective on this, I think, this important facet of left media. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks to our audience for joining us. Until next time, this is Alexander Lee for Democratic Left.